Ukraine has been hit by North Korean missiles in two of the biggest bombardments since the start of the war. We're in Kharkiv again, and this is a scene of yet another Russian strike. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is the latest roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with these two missile bombardments either side of New Year's Day, which have been the deadliest since the war began almost 2 years ago. US officials have said that they believe North Korean missiles were included in the barrage of more than 300 missiles and 200 drones fired over 2 days on the night of the 29th of December and the night of the 2nd of January. Ukrainian officials say more than 50 people killed and at least 160 people injured. Many of those missiles were shot down, including the largest flight of Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Those are Russia's most sophisticated, advanced missiles that in theory can maneuver at enormous speed. But so far, Ukrainian officials insist all of the Kinzhals fired since US Patriot air defense systems arrived. Ukrainian officials say the Patriots have shot the Kinzhals down. Nonetheless, John Kirby, the spokesman for the National Security Council in America, described the inclusion of North Korean ballistic missiles as a worrying escalation, sign that Russia is managing to get its hands on more advanced weapons. It comes at the time, we understand, separately, Moscow is also pressing on with talks with Iran to get its hands on Iranian ballistic missiles as well. Now, what does this show us? Well, in one sense, it confirms what we've already known, which is that Russian stockpiles of weapons, particularly of its most advanced, sophisticated and expensive weapons, are depleting, and that's because Russia is firing so many of them, and it's because Russia is struggling to reproduce them, to manufacture them, because many of those weapons rely on imported parts, and those parts have become harder to get hold of because of sanctions. Nonetheless, you'll remember that at the end of last year, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un travelled to Russia, met President Vladimir Putin, and it would appear that the fruits of that meeting are beginning to arrive in Russia's arsenal. We're seeing at least one North Korean missile, according to John Kirby, according to the White House, fired on the night of the 29th of December. Now, that he said that missile had a range of around 900 kilometers. It was fired in a southwesterly direction from a ground-based launcher in Russian territory, and it landed in a field near Zaporizhia. Heartening in one sense, it appears that the missile did not reach its target, but Kirby warned that North Korea and Russia would learn from these firings. A few days later, several missiles fired. He said the US was still analysing information about where those missiles may have been aimed at and what they may have hit. The White House didn't say what kind of missiles North Korea had provided, but it did say that it had intelligence that North Korea had given Russia several missiles and several missile launchers. The primary concern appears to be that this is a boost to Russia's stockpile, a boost to the number of missiles that it may be able to unleash against Ukraine. The next thing I wanted to talk about today is the way that Ukraine has been striking back. Since our last update, there have been a number of really interesting developments. Perhaps the most dramatic is the destruction of another Rapucha-class landing ship, the Novocharsk, in an eastern port in occupied Crimea, so on the far side of Crimea from the territory that Ukraine's armed forces currently control. This was a ship that had been damaged before in the war, appeared to have been in dock for repairs and hit by, we think, cruise missiles. This would bring to at least 13 the number of Russian warships and, of course, a submarine that have been destroyed since the start of the war almost 2 years ago. A significant result for Ukraine. We've also seen in the last couple of days footage which appears to show a Sukhoi 34, an Su-34 fighter bomber aircraft on fire at an airfield more than 1,000 miles inside Russian territory. The suggestion from Ukrainian officials that this was the result of Ukrainian saboteurs showing once again their ability to strike deep inside Russian soil. And only today, the latest news is of more explosions in occupied Crimea, both in Yevpatoria and in Sebastopol, so on the southern tip of the peninsula and on the western edge, not so far away. These strikes, it's not clear what they've hit yet, but in the past what we have seen is strikes against command posts, strikes against anti-air defences to try and limit Russia's ability to defend the peninsula. That is then often followed by more attacks against the high-value targets like the ships, the submarine, and as we've seen, the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the naval headquarters in Sebastopol. The final thing I really want to talk about today is good news. There has been a significant prisoner swap, one of the largest prisoner swaps of the war. Some almost 500 soldiers being returned to their native countries. That was 230 Ukrainian prisoners, mostly military, a handful of civilians returned to Ukraine, 248 Russians returned to Russia, and it brings to nearly 3,000 the number of Russian soldiers who've been returned from Ukraine over the course of the conflict. This swap was significant not only because of its size, but also because it was the first big prisoner swap since August. And the talks, the sort of background talks between Russia and Ukraine that facilitate these swaps have been under some strain. Ukraine thanked the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, for the part that it played in facilitating these negotiations. While we're on the subject of negotiations, perhaps one other thing to mention is an ongoing discussion that's bubbling around at the moment over whether or not Ukraine missed an opportunity to make peace with Russia in the first few weeks of the war. Now, this theory, this narrative, focuses on talks that were taking place in Istanbul between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators on the 29th of March, so just a couple of months after Russia unleashed its full-scale invasion. Russia and Vladimir Putin have repeatedly claimed that these talks had effectively reached an agreement. It was at that point that Russia, certainly this is what the Russians say, agreed to withdraw their troops from around Kyiv. They claim that Ukraine somehow appeared to renege on its agreement and then decided to fight on. Significantly, about 10 days after those talks, Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson arrived in Kyiv. He was one of the first heads of government to visit President Zelensky in Kyiv. There's a suggestion from Russia that America and possibly also Britain were instrumental in encouraging Ukraine to fight on rather than make peace. However, from what I can tell, there was a combination of factors. Ukraine, for a start, has been adamant that no agreement was reached, no commitments were made. And of course, what happened is as Russian soldiers retreated from Kyiv, this wasn't necessarily a retreat they made as they claimed as a gesture of free will. They made that retreat because their assault on Kyiv was in chaos. They'd had that 40-mile convoy that had been bogged down in mud. They'd lost huge numbers of armoured vehicles and troops from harassing and guerrilla-style attacks from the Ukrainians. They were forced to retreat. And as they did, as the Ukrainians reclaimed those northwestern suburbs of Kyiv, places like Bucha, Borodyanka, Irpin, but particularly Bucha, the atrocities that they uncovered made the prospects of negotiations with the Russians untenable. I mean, that was certainly the message coming out of President Zelensky, who described what had happened as a genocide. And a report in the Wall Street Journal from a very well-informed journalist suggests that when Boris Johnson visited Zelensky, the message he gave was pretty clear, which was that it is entirely up to the Ukrainians to make the decision as to whether or not they want to fight on. But if they did fight on, then Britain would be ready to support them 100%. As ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you're watching on YouTube and you have questions, please write them in the comments below and we'll endeavour to answer them next time. Some of the questions from the last episode, a few questions in fact, have focused on losses, Russian losses, numbers of losses, and why there appears to be a discrepancy between the figures put out by the Ukrainian government and the figures shared by Western officials both in the United States and the United Kingdom and elsewhere. The current Ukrainian estimate of Russian losses stands at about 360,000. The last time I heard an estimate of Russian losses from senior British officials, it was at about, they estimated Russia had lost about 300,000. Now, there is a bit of a discrepancy. What most of this tends to be, one of the questions is Ukraine overstating them? Are the West being overcautious? There's probably a little bit of that, but one of the things to point out is that these figures, it's not always clear whether these figures are referring to soldiers killed in action or a combination of killed and wounded in action. Ukraine talks about combat losses. Often a soldier who is wounded is effectively a combat loss because he or she cannot rejoin the fight. So whilst there is a discrepancy, it's not perhaps as large as people think. The Western estimates that I've heard, as I said, 300,000 Russian losses, and perhaps around 80,000 of those are soldiers who've been killed in action. But you know, that figure I'm referring to is a few weeks old, and indeed US officials have said recently they think at least 13,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, not just wounded, killed in the ongoing assault on Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. Avdiivka appearing to be another Bakhmut in that sense, a place where Russia is expending huge resources, particularly human resources, but military material as well, as it tries to take a town in the eastern Donbass. Second question today is about China's relationship with Russia and whether or not China is supplying weapons. You may remember a few weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin met Xi Jinping, China's premier, and they announced a friendship with no limits. And what's become clear since the invasion is that Russia has pushed that friendship very much to its limits. Russia was hoping that China would furnish it with arms, with ammunition. We understand there has been some supply of weapons from China to Russia, but certainly, or at least it doesn't appear to be at a level which Western officials say is changing the nature of the conflict or tipping it decisively in Russia's favour. So whilst Beijing appears to be sort of hedging its bet, giving Russia weapons but not giving them enough to sort of invoke the anger of the West. Third and final question today is about how this conflict is likely to evolve, and specifically if Ukraine were to get the 500,000 extra troops which President Zelensky has said his military commanders want, and if it was to get the aid from both the United States and Europe, which it wants, aid which is currently sort of held up in administrative hurdles, political hurdles in Washington and in Brussels, is there any guarantee that in 6 months' time the situation would be any different to what it is now? I mean, crucially, I think that the question was, would it be less desperate? Well, there is no guarantee. What we're seeing is, from both sides, is an effort to find new sources of resources to fight the conflict. In many ways, as we've said before, the conflict on the ground, on the battlefield, has reached a sort of stalemate. That's a characterization President Zelensky has repeatedly rejected, but it is a characterization that many, indeed his own military and independent military analysts, would probably agree with. Potentially, large numbers of troops, new weapons, new technology might be able to tip the conflict in one side's favour or another. But we know General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's general, has said he doesn't think that there will be a clean and beautiful breakthrough. He doesn't think necessarily that the technology exists to create that sort of overwhelming change in the balance on the battlefield. More likely then is that this is a war of attrition, both attrition of resources and attrition of will. Russia certainly shows no sign at the moment of any let-up in its ambition or its will, nor does Ukraine. Where both sides are struggling is in resourcing their armies. And we know that there's about $60 billion of US aid which has been held up by US Republicans, objections from US Republicans in Washington. There's about a similar quantity of aid in Europe which has been held up by objections from Hungary. Those are the problems. Those remain significant challenges for Ukraine. I've said many times before, the greatest threat to Ukraine remains the resolve of its international allies. Thank you again for watching and listening. As I said before, if you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below the YouTube video and we'll endeavour to answer them next time.